Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Over the past few episodes, specifically the past 6 episodes, we have been looking at the wives of Henry VIII. And on this, I guess you could say, postscript episode, we're going to be looking at the demise of Henry VIII. So, Chris, when we think about Henry VIII, we think about a man who started off as a very powerful king, ruled England for 38 years, almost 40 years. But at the end of his life, he is in a lot of ways a shell of who he had been when he first came to power at 17 years old, 38 years earlier.
Yeah, and to also think about his death and all that has gone on. We've talked about the six wives of Henry VIII, and we've tried to make sure that they have a place in history that people can remember them by. And all of the drama that has unfolded with all of these wives, and of course we haven't even really gotten too deep with political, the religious, and all of the other things. But he dies at age 55, so all of this is going to be compartmentalized into 55 years of holy reign of terror, if you will, and just so many different aspects. So many lives were changed, and the course of history was changed, all because of his rulings, because of his, maybe even because of his intimidation and the fear that people had upon him. And Ray, in talking about the postscript, what is really fascinating is that while he brought all of the fear into people at the beginning of his reign or during his reign, it will ultimately be the fear that he has as he prepares to die.
Yeah, and you talk about fear. King Henry VIII, when he came, to power, again, we said a minute ago, at 17 years old, people were optimistic about this young man who's going to be king. He was athletic. He was everything the nation maybe wanted in a king. But by the end of his reign, Chris, you talk about his violence and his reign of terror. Over 72,000 people had been executed by King Henry VIII, and two of those were his wives. What a great guy.
Yeah, and I mean, and it goes all the way up until his death, because 9 days before he dies, he's still executing people. I think his last victim is Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, who is the last person to die at the hands of King Henry VIII. And it just goes to show that he was a sick man. He was a frail man. He was an injured man. He was a demented man. But he still had this strong arm on people and on the country.
And you talk about him being a sick man, and I think a lot of historians, when they look at Henry VIII's demise and they look at his and first off, before we even get to that, let's talk about the fact he died at 55 years of age, okay, which today would be very young. I mean, there are people who die in their 40s and 50s today, but today, you would think, what's the average lifespan today? 75, 77, somewhere along in there. The average lifespan at this time was around 40 years old. So even though he did die at 55, he had outlived a lot of people, his own age. A lot of people who, maybe the average person on the street, a lot of these people didn't live as long as Henry did. So even though we look at him and say, yeah, he died at a young age, for his contemporaries, not so much.
Right. And I mean, you think about the longevity, what he was able to cram into those 55 years, books, movies, podcasts. I mean,
Yep.
all kinds of things have been written and spoken about him. But, I do think that it is interesting that he started his reign being known as a virtuous prince.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as our listeners have journeyed with us over just talking about his relationships, there's very little virtue here, and there's very little of a Prince Charming in this aspect either.
No, but we've talked about this several times as we talked about the various wives of Henry VIII and how he came to meet each and every one of them. A number of them, he met at court. Before his final days, before his health really began to decline and he began gaining weight, he was obviously a person who was very athletic. He loved hunts. He loved playing tennis. He loved jousting, which, is that jousting that is a lot of historians sort of place as sort of the turning point when he has a jousting accident, and the horse falls on top of him.
Yeah, I mean, he he was one. He kind of reminds me of, some of the people in history who just do these crazy things, and they just kind of got these moments in history. And I mean, here's King Henry VIII, who liked a good old fight. And usually, when people would fight the king in jousting, I mean, the whole purpose was for the king to win. I mean, the whole purpose was for him to get that testosterone going, to feel good about, look what I can do, to woo the ladies, to impress the people of the country, and also to intimidate foreign powers. And so as he's doing this jousting match, it just so happens, wrong guy, wrong time, wrong place. And he gets hit, and not only does he get hit, he gets so hard that it knocks him off, but it also causes the horse to spur out of control and to land on him. And Ray, this is pretty much going to be the beginning of the demise of him. He was of really good stature. He was very good looking before this. He was very put together. He could speak. He could, had good mind. But after this, things start to fall apart.
Yeah, there's definitely, I'm not a medical doctor, but I think there's definitely evidence of some sort of head trauma there. He was unconscious following being knocked off the horse and the horse landing on him. He was unconscious for several hours. I noted one source said about 2 hours where he was not conscious, and there was a fear among his closest advisors, I guess you could say, that he was not going to survive the accident. But of course he did, and when he comes back, there's some personality changes. Maybe he's a little bit more erratic than he had been, which of course wouldn't be too terribly surprising considering he may have had a pretty bad head injury. But he comes back, and he's injured his leg as well, so he's not as mobile as he was. And of course, how it is. Someone like Henry VIII, it hurts to walk, it's painful to walk, so he doesn't walk a lot. He gains weight, so he walks even less. He gains more weight, so he walks even less, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. And Chris, he's not eating spinach and lettuce and stuff like that. He's eating a lot of red meat, a lot of rich food, a lot of red wine. So he starts packing on the pounds. In fact, one source said that at the time of his death, he weighed a little over 350 pounds.
Yeah, not only that, but he, as you mentioned, he had gout, he had leg ulcers, things where he couldn't walk. And so they had a thing back then which was similar to a wheelchair. They called it a tram or a tram or something like that, that they had to use to get him from point A to point B. And this was debilitating physically, but also mentally for him, because kings were to be feared. And he is now not being feared because he's in a wheelchair. He's not thinking properly. He's very large. He's slow. And, now women are turned off by him because of his anger, because of his looks, because of a lot of things. So he is going through a major shift, and it creates even more angst for him, because what once had been this virtuous, youthful, good-looking prince, he's now become this ogre, if you will, that nobody wants to be around.
Yeah, very much so. And he had to be miserable. Not just simply because of his growing size and whatever head issues he had, but you mentioned the gout and the swelling of the legs and things like that. So he had to be in a lot of pain. And we have to remember that in the mid 16th century, there wasn't you couldn't grab the Advil or the Tylenol or anything like that. There wasn't a lot to help him get through the pain. But of course he does. He keeps pushing. One thing I found, Chris, that I thought was very interesting, it was illegal to talk about the king's death. it was a crime. So when things start moving progressively in that direction where it's becoming very evident to people around him, it's not like they can openly talk about it. You can't, just sit down with the king and say, I think you need to call hospice in. That's not a conversation you can have with this king.
It's treason
Yeah.
because it's seen as willing or wanting the death of a king in per se. And yet here's the problem. So imagine you're the priest or the doctor, and the doctor goes to the priest and says, hey man, he's not going to make it much longer. And I mean, Henry wants to receive Holy Communion. He wants to receive the last rites, even though he wanted to break away from Rome. He still wants to keep all the traditions. This is a whole other discussion, but he wants to receive these things. But the doctors are very difficult to try to announce the news to him, but yet he needs to have time to prepare his soul, which is something that everybody wants to make sure is that before you depart this earth, that your soul is taken care of. And so a man by the name of Sir Anthony Denny needed to talk to King Henry VIII. And he said, hey, I just need you to know that you're not going to live much longer, and you need to remember your sins as a good Christian does. And, Henry said that Christ is going to pardon me of all my sins. Christ is going to take care of all of me, even though they're greater than they can be. And he was right about that, right? Because his sins, there was much more than he could count on his toes and his feet or his
Yeah,
fingers.
absolutely. And this Sir Anthony Denny, what a brave man he was. In the last few months of his life, he has to go into the king and not simply tell him, you're in your final days. You need to make sure your spiritual needs are met, but you also need to make sure your will is correct. And he goes in and he reads a will um that is supposedly Henry's. Henry denies that it's his will, and the whole will thing becomes a whole, I guess you could say, Chris, a hullabaloo, trying to get this will set up the way Henry wants it. Because initially, like I said a second ago, he reads this will, and Henry goes, "That's not the will I wanted. I wanted another one. You need to go find the correct will." And so, of course, this Anthony Denny had to be a very brave man to be able to go in to the king and say, number one, you're dying, so we need to make sure your soul is right and your will is right. And of course, the first thing the king says is, that will is not what I want. And there's a whole thing about Henry's will and what exactly he wanted, and was it, possibly changed after his death. There was a whole series of questions and issues related to his will. One of them that I found very interesting and almost very modern in some sense, Chris, was that apparently he wasn't signing his name to documents anymore. At this particular point, he had gotten to the point where he had a stamp where they would stamp his signature on something. So that brings the question, did he really personally stamp this, or did somebody stamp it for him?
And he's dealing with 6 wives.
Mm-hmm.
He's angered a lot of men inside the royal court. And it's very difficult because he was not functioning properly. So even if he did, you'd never know because he wasn't sure what he was doing. And, I have all of these things kind of going against him. And what I find interesting is that he is distancing himself from anyone that might have any concern, any care for him, which is why, once again, history didn't know but should. We must remember Sir Anthony Denny, because he's one that actually stood up to the king and survived.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the midst of changing of wills and in the midst of, sir, you're going to die. And I know it's treason that I tell you this, but I care about you. And I want to make sure that, your soul is right with God before you depart this earth. And, that's why we study this. We study this to learn these lessons, and also to appreciate people who are willing to stand in the gap and to do the things that are difficult, to speak the words that are hard to speak. There's lessons here from Sir Anthony Denny, who I'm sure didn't want to do it, but felt called to do it.
Yeah, and eventually they do call in the Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, I guess, to have that final conversation with Henry. But by the time Cranmer gets to the room, Henry is no longer conscious. He has fallen unconscious. But Cranmer states that he asked the king, even in his unconscious state, if he had his sins forgiven if he died with faith in Christ. And Cranmer said the king squeezed his hand. So the Cranmer took that to be evidence of the fact that King Henry VIII was right with God in his final moments. Not sure
Yeah,
what we can make of that, though.
yeah, and I also think that Denny asked Cramner if he wanted anyone to, if he wanted Cranmer to speak with him or whatever. And, that's who King Henry VIII requested. That's who he did want to talk to. But his final words, I mean, here's the virtuous prince, this valiant king, this really just guy that has so many adjectives could be described about him, that his final words, are that, if I have any words, it should be with Dr. Cranmer.
Yeah.
I will first take a little sleep, and then as I feel myself, I will advise upon the matter. And he never got around to advising upon the matter.
No. No, and it's interesting to me that they kept his death under wraps for about 3 days. And in order to keep the secret of the king's death before they could get Edward VI, Henry's only son, who was, 7, 8, 9 years old at the time, before they could get his only son in place, they had to sort of do a little deception game. So they would bring in Henry's mules, and they were carrying on as usual, as if the king was still alive. But the reality of it was he was dead and rotting by that particular point in time.
And what I think also, you're talking about the squeezing of the hand and things of that nature, is that Henry VIII dies with no one there, all alone, none able to speak, unable to get out to move. And he died all alone. And, it just makes you wonder, what the final thoughts were of King Henry VIII.
Yeah.
What did he do? Did he repent? Did he really feel bad? And I do think it is interesting that when they finally announced it, that there was a steady stream of tears, that there was shedding of tears. And, I mean, they bring in, Edward and say the king is dead, but then long live the king. I mean, did
The
the
king
people,
moves on.
yeah, but what did the people really feel?
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to tell. I mean, I'm not a British historian, so there's my knowledge as far as the social history of what was going on in larger English society at the time is very, very much lacking. But I have to think, Chris, here's a man who had ruled over England for almost 40 years. He ruled over their empire for quite some time. And I guess there were a lot of people who, Chris, this was the only king they ever knew. This was the only monarch they ever knew. And now here's Edward VI, just a child. And of course, there's going to be a committee that's going to do a lot of ruling for him, at least for a little while. But a lot of nervousness about what is to come. But I've got to think also, Chris, if you're looking at Henry VIII and you're thinking over 72,000 people dead because of him executing them, there's got to be a portion of society, maybe just his political opponents, the reformers and people like that, but there's got to be a portion of society there that is probably pretty happy to see him go.
But his death was magnificent as far as the burial and the
Yeah.
ceremony and things of that nature. And I think it's interesting. It took 16 individuals, I think, to carry his coffin, to lower it into the grave. I mean, 16. And I also found it interesting that from one thing that I read, that Queen Catherine Farr watched the sermon during
Mm-hmm.
the funeral service from Catherine of Aragon's closet. And so it's just interesting how, as this was going, they didn't still want to be public. They wanted to watch from a distance. They wanted to be apart without being apart. And just it's just, I mean, I don't know. Can you say though it's a sad story?
I think so. I think, but you think about it. I mean, think about this, Chris. When you die, which let's hope it's many years in the future yet, but when you die, you hope your children will fulfill your wishes. You hope your children will, um, you know, you hope your family will be there. You hope your children will do what you want, fulfill your wishes. Henry's family was not there. His children were not there. And in fact, after his death, he's buried in an unmarked grave next to Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel there in Windsor Castle. And all the plans he had for a big tomb and all that kind of stuff went up in smoke. Neither King Edward VI, Queen Mary, or Queen Elizabeth during their reigns sought to fulfill his final wishes.
And you know what a powerful 7 episodes this has been on studying the ex-wives of Henry VIII, but also the postscript on Henry VIII and the tragedy that he brought to not just his own immediate family, but to the people who were living then, but also the descendants of these people who would carry the name, who would carry the scars, who would carry the stories. It just speaks a lot, probably more so to the British than to Americans, but still, it is a tragedy that has been found in movies and books and textbooks. We talk about it in class, and I appreciate you and I appreciate our listeners, because the one thing that I was hoping would take place as we talked about these this series is that the names of the wives would be remembered, they would be heard, and their stories would be shared. And I think we did that, and I think we did it well.
Absolutely. And you know, Chris, it's almost like this last episode was the doom and gloom episode. The episode that, it's like, man, I'm started off in a good mood. Listen to that episode. Now I'm in the dumps. We promise our next episode, we're going to pick it up a little bit and move in a different direction. But Chris, great idea. Of course, it was your idea to do the series on the wives of Henry VIII after watching the Broadway play Six.
That's it.
Six. And then of course the wonderful postscript episode, which is so depressing, is my idea. So we're holding true. All right, listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. We're available on Spotify, iHeart Podcast, and wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.